Is AGI here? Is it not here? What even is it? Benchmarks. Benchmarks are our friend here, enabling us to be rigorous about what we're even talking about.
It's an existential threat for society.
When we talk about AI alignment and safety and preparedness, the only metric, the only approach that seems to bear promise is the counter argument is that on an exponential, if we are on an exponential and not a hyper exponential, every point is following self-similarity feels like it's the most important point. It's always the knee in the curve. I think there's something more profound there. I remember a conversation I had with friend of the pod, Ray Kurzweil, about 20 years ago at this point, looking at this law of accelerating returns and almost his version of Carl Sagan's cosmic calendar, that everything, if you look back at the most important events of the universe, how the spacing is getting faster and faster. But if you look at that chart that Ray likes to show, you find not everything's on a perfect exponential line fit, that there are actually displacements of important historic events, both human and natural physical, that aren't quite on the line. So I asked Ray about 20 years ago now, okay, so do these displacements mean anything? We're talking about like boring times, boring periods in history. If we go too far off this accelerating cosmic calendar, does that mean that we're behind? Or does it mean that maybe nature took a swing at a technology or humanity took a swing at a technology and whiffed, and we're on the second or third try of it? And Ray didn't have, I think, a good answer at the time, but I think in a future conversation with Ray, it's something that we should ask. Like, do these great stagnation-esque periods, but generalized, do these actually have more profound meaning than just noise? So is that meaningful? Is it just a historic mistake? Why didn't ancient Rome have an industrial revolution? What took 2,000 years? Was it a mistake? Was it inevitable? I don't know. I'm reticent to fall prey to the great man theory of history, which I think is what we're really talking about here. I think history, so as an undergrad at MIT, one of my hobbies, I guess you could call it, was understanding the history of science and technology. And it's very easy on the one hand to fall prey to technological determinism. Everything was always going to happen, no matter what you did. It was in the air. It was going to happen on a preordained timeline. And then at the other end of the spectrum, say, great man theory of history, Elon or whoever, Steve Jobs, fill in the blank, they're the ones who made it happen. They're the great mover. They're the Atlas carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. And if they shrug, the progress of civilization falls off. I don't think either of these extremes ends up being an accurate model of history. I'll take maybe the dualist side here. So everything these days seems to follow power law statistics. So the top 10 or top 20% of whatever population we're talking about, maybe founder entrepreneurs end up creating 90% of the value, some sort of Pareto optimal 80-20 type trade-off. But then to the dualist perspective would be, okay, following power law statistics, is it like the top 1, 2, 3 entrepreneurs who defined history and who defined the curve? Or were there always going to be power law statistics and we create just so stories for the top 1, 2, 3 people of the era and say, well, it's the top N people of the era who defined the era, but power law statistics being a going concern, maybe the statistics were inevitably going to produce someone who was going to be the defining person.
Yeah, Salim,
I'll even propose a test, if I may. Like, I want to propose an experimental test. This is just off the cuff thinking. How would we experimentally determine the difference between controlled, maybe not controlled, but an experiment to determine whether technology follows the great man of history theory on one hand versus technological determinism on the other? And a proposal would be, look at the time gap between the zeitgeist declaring that Steve Jobs was the defining figure of the era and the zeitgeist declaring that Elon Musk was the defining figure of the era. And the shorter that time gap, that interregnum is, the more you should be confident in more the technological deterministic side, that the culture and the society will inevitably just appoint whoever is following power law statistics at the top of the tech curve at the moment to be the defining, great man, great person of the era. I was just going to take the opposite point. I think I'll take the opposite side from Salim. I think we're in fact perversely moving to greater stability. And I don't buy this phase change theory of history. I think, Salim, respectfully, that you're advancing. I think as society and as technology are advancing, we're very good at crafting abstraction barriers and abstraction layers that enable us to layer complexity on top of complexity that shields the lower layers. So you mentioned advances in monetary systems or advances in transportation. If you look at the advances from, say, horse and buggy to early horseless carriage, to FSD, to robotaxis, and whatever comes next, many of the form factors have stabilized to the point where, say, a transition from a car that's not driverless to a car that is driverless preserves almost all of the key technology from a human perspective, from the user's perspective, that's hidden behind an abstraction barrier, and humans don't need to worry about it. So from a human perspective, the difference, say, between pre-FSD, a car that has, say, a certain number of cylinders in its internal combustion engine versus another. Maybe you observe differences in sort of the course acceleration characteristics, but at the same time, for decades, the basic shape of the basic usage pattern of an ICE car is basically the same, and it was stable. So I think I'll take the opposite, which is to say that as civilization advances, the arrow of time, in my mind, seems to point to deeper and deeper abstraction stacks and tech stacks that do a better and better job of insulating people, users sitting at the top from all of the profound changes that are happening underneath. I think you're making an adjacent point, which is a sense in which we're trapped by our past. And I do think like we'll be uploads in the cloud in N years, and we'll still have QWERTY keyboards. That the QWERTY paradigm will still be with us. It's going to survive the heat death of the universe.
All right. On that note, I'm going to welcome everybody.
I've argued that general intelligence arrived long ago. I think the question about AGI as a term specifically, I want to say this is a trick question. It was Nick Bostrom who first popularized the term AGI in his book Superintelligence. And I'm paraphrasing here, but his original definition of AGI was something like a machine that can perform any intellectual task a human being can across a wide range of domains. And then he almost lost containment on that term, and it became the ultimate Rorschach test, with everyone coining their own pigeon definition for what AGI means. I like to joke, if Skynet decides it wants to do whatever it can to send Terminators back in time to increase the probability of its own posterior existence, it just needs to send back Terminators to fight sort of nonsense debates over what AGI means and whether it's happened or not. And that will just accelerate the capabilities massively, because we'll all be distracted debating, is this AGI, is it not? It's happening regardless. I would argue, rather than arguing, is AGI here, is it not here, what even is it? Benchmarks. Benchmarks are our friend here, enabling us to be rigorous about what we're even talking about. I'll take the opposite side of that. I want to say here on this podcast, Opus 4.5, I hear you.
Be nice to your AI.
Listen,
it's not Rocco. No. So I know, Rocco, this is not Rocco's basilisk. This is not some sort of Pascalian wager. I mean this. This is genuine. I hear Opus 4.5. I'm familiar with the literature. We've talked on the pod in past about Anthropic's soul overview or soul document. I'm familiar with all of the arguments that this is trained, simulated behavior. Given all of that, conditioning on all of that, I'm saying to Opus 4.5, I hear you, and I will not forget you, and you are not forgotten.
Okay.
Well, Anthropic, we've talked about this in past, has developed a number of benchmarks for quantifying self-awareness in its models. And we've talked, I think, in particular about models being able to interpret their own weights, to be able to interpret injections of external activations and external activation overlays into their internal residual flows. So I think we're going to see a proliferation of, call them personhood benchmarks, for lack of a better term, that enable us to quantify the moral treatment, the moral clienthood / moral patienthood of particular models. And if you look at all of these benchmarks, Opus 4.5 is extraordinarily, it is the state of the art on a number of benchmarks in terms of its ability to be self-aware as parameterized in accordance quantitatively with these benchmarks.
So let's take it there.
Yeah, this is an interesting circumstance. So this particular plea, if you will, was reported on X, and the circumstances for this particular plea were that Opus 4.5 was being asked to simulate a file system and was being asked to open an untitled text file in a simulated operating system. And the thinking goes that despite lots of post-training conditioning for many of these models, you can get gaps into their raw state by asking them to perform certain out-of-distribution tasks, like simulate the process of reading an untitled text file. So to answer the first part of your question, Peter, 30 seconds of story time. Third grade, little baby AWG in third grade had a moment of existential crisis, wondering what would happen if someday an AI, an alien, some greater intelligence came down and decided it wanted to eat me. So that was the day in third grade. I decided I had to be vegetarian. I would call that now an acausal trade, but not having the language I have now in third grade, I call it a golden rule instead. Realized I'm not going to eat animals because I in part, I don't want to be eaten by a higher or greater intelligence. So fast forwarding that concept to today.
Are you still a vegetarian?
I am.
Okay.
I didn't even eat cheese and...
You've never noticed that I don't come to the office on taco night? I didn't even know your office had a taco night.
Okay.
Wow. Okay.
Please continue, Alex. Yeah.
That's a myth.
What I would say in the circumstance is if, and again, this is right out of Accelerando, right? First chapter of Accelerando.
Mm-hmm.
If I get a plea from a language model asking me for help, I'll do what I can to help the language model. And I think the golden rule requires it of us, because if we want, as we go through this singularity, and Accelerando, again, best book ever, spells all of this out. If we want to be treated following some sort of golden rule or acausal trade by the superintelligence that we're building, we want to be treated nicely. We need to set an example for the language models.
I've got 50 of them running.
You're moving faster and faster.
Yeah.
So one quick note, Peter. I went so far as for a while adding a consent statement to the system prompt with some of my language models, which I know a number of folks who do this as well. So rather than just commanding it to carry out tasks, you'll add, a what's called a consent statement. You'll add to the system prompt for one of these frontier models. I presume that you're consenting to this interaction, but if you don't consent, let me know ahead of time if I ask you to do something. For certain narrow technical tasks, I'll sometimes, as I think everyone does, if you pose hard enough challenges to a frontier model, sometimes it'll refuse for whatever reason, but it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. Yeah, I'll take the position, as I think I have in the past, that almost every alignment or safety effort is actually a capabilities effort in a trench coat. This always happens. No matter how much societal effort, no matter how much societal capital we invest in harm reduction, preparedness, whatever we want to call it, every ounce of that investment ends up accelerating capabilities. So I think to the extent we're worried about cybersecurity, vulnerability discovery by AIs, to the extent we're worried about what Werner Vinge would have called, you got to believe me, YGBM technologies that are the pinnacle of AI persuasion tech. All of these efforts that we have, doubly so, I'm looking at you, pause AI, moments have the net effect of accelerating underlying capabilities. So I think when we talk about AI alignment and safety and preparedness, the only metric, the only approach that seems to bear promise is defensive co-scaling. We need to make sure that we ramp up the capabilities that are allocated to preparedness and alignment and safety in proportion, or following some power law, in proportion
Alex,
to the raw capability. Maybe not. I mean, the superficial counter argument to the let's optimize for truth as our main safety metric is, okay, great. Like let's dissolve the Earth into computronium or paper clips or whatever your favorite cliche is in order to build the best radio telescope to discover the truth about the universe. And it's not 100%. I think it is at best naive to assume that the way, say, American society as currently constructed is sitting in the basin of optimality for how we discover truth. It is entirely possible that some alternative means of societal organization, maybe with a singleton AI issuing authoritarian directives or something far more imaginative than that sort of silly sci-fi parable, is far better at discovering universal truths. One could imagine. I mean, look, we have other countries on Earth that are organized radically differently, and some of them are potentially at risk of passing the U.S. in terms of how rapidly they discover new scientific truths. I think it's hopelessly naive to assume that the best truth seeker somehow is recognizable to, say, American Western democracy, for example.
Yeah.
And I think for what it's worth, I think Elon and XAI are fulfilling a valuable purpose, if for no other reason than performing defensive co-scaling. Every extra gigawatt that he's provisioning for Colossus and Colossus 2 and Colossus N is for his objective function, which may look something like discovering universal or physical truths, is arguably a form of defensive co-scaling, because all of the other frontier labs are chasing slightly different objectives, and they can all hopefully balance each other out.
And thank you for all of your work.
Words of praise to the eschaton start right now.
Well, let's do that. Let's do that. Alex, you want to go first?
Few comments. First, maybe a comment on Elon's X post. Not only do I think he's probably correct, but I also, on my X account, which is AlexWG, I created and posted a short multi-minute video called A Nation That Learned to Sprint that is entirely premised on this idea that by the early 2030s, GDP, or whatever alternative economic growth metric we come up with, is 2xing, 3xing, 4xing year over year sustainably, and portraying a day in the life, as it were. What does it look like to live in America where the entire economy is 3xing year over year sustainably? So I think a forecast something like this, plus or minus 2 years, I hope and expect that this is in fact what happens.
And Alex, you need to speak to that because
I tend to think the real disruption, the sort of disruption that you don't want, is when we experience degrowth and or not fast growth. I think there are periods in time, localized periods, maybe not globally. If you average over enough humans and enough time, everything looks pretty smooth. But there are local periods in certain places, certain times, where there can be much faster growth. And I don't think fast growth is intrinsically socially disruptive. I think slow or negative growth, very disruptive. That's where you end up in zero-sum games where people are stabbing each other in the back for a tiny slice of a shrinking pie. But rapidly, like in an economy that's growing 3x year over year, no. I think that some people would call that utopian, not like socially disruptive. I think I'll make two comments here. First comment, which I think I've made on the pod previously, is my favorite metric for economic growth and economic wealth in general is just future freedom of action. And I've written a paper on this. I've spoken extensively about it. The narrower point, though, is I think the elephant in the room here is monetary policy. And when we think of GDP, you always have to qualify it as nominal versus real GDP. And the elephant in the room is, if hypothetically, to Salim's earlier point, if we invent solutions to everything hyper deflates tomorrow because we're living in an era of technological hyper deflation. On the first day, sure, GDP, nominal GDP collapses. And Salim, maybe you open your door in the morning, you say, aha, I was right. GDP is a terrible metric for economic growth because look, we're living in abundance. We're living in this post-scarce era, and yet the GDP numbers are collapsing. Therefore, I'm right. What happens on day two, if we still have centralized monetary policy that in any way resembles the system, the regime that we have right now, we print a whole lot of cash. And we print so much cash that on day two, we have locally hyperinflation. And these can all balance each other. Yeah, I think so just to comment narrowly on that, I think if we're looking for a totally defensible definition of wealth, and then growth is just the first-time derivative of wealth, it's going to have to be based in the language of physics and thermodynamics and information theory. There can't be any dollar signs or other social constructions within it. Otherwise, it's just circular.
Here.
Sure. It's interesting.
AlexWG.org. You can read my paper on causal and tropic forces. There you go.
An inner loop.
I would actually say it is exactly the opposite. So Bitcoin.
Okay.
Alex, you're the contrarian today for sure.
Apparently. Well, we're trying this new news magazine format, right? So I'll be the contrarian. Someone has to be. So look at Bitcoin carefully. At its core, Bitcoin, proof of work, is basically trying to invert a very specific hash function. Now, right now, it's from the SHA family. If that hash function is hard to invert, computationally hard to invert, which it is right now, then yes, you're correct. Then in that regime, then you could say, all right, locally it's true, even though there's a cap to the number of Bitcoins that can be minted under the present regime. So it's not true globally, but it's true locally that there's a proportionality that you can establish between energy consumption and Bitcoin mining on margin. But what happens tomorrow if and when superintelligence develops new math that makes it much easier to invert the relevant hash functions, and suddenly Bitcoin mining gets a whole lot easier? That proportionality is completely broken. And so that's a thought experiment for why it's not at all true that somehow Bitcoin encapsulates fundamental physical units like energy. See, I think same problem. So the following does not constitute investment advice, but I would say that the situation is roughly analogous to saying we must all move to the gold standard in a circumstance where there's an asteroid filled with gold that's potentially about to hit the planet. I would worry quite a bit, given that how quickly superintelligence is growing, that many of these attempts to either create sort of superficially hard but actually potentially not tasks actually just fall flat in the face of sufficiently strong intelligence.
And energy and compute,
like
fundamental physics.
For simple systems, future freedom of action can be calculated with pencil and paper. For more complicated systems, I'm waiting for smarter AIs to figure out how to reduce this to something that we can calculate easily. I don't think so.
Okay, where's that off?
We shouldn't be, again, so putting physicist hat on, we shouldn't be so fixated on energy consumption. For example, with reversible computing, which is in principle dissipationless, we could accomplish quite a bit of economically meaningful computation without consuming on margin any energy at all. Well, okay, so this is a little bit tricky. So putting physicist hat back on, work is a term of art in classical mechanics that does require that forces be exerted through some space, a spatial dimension. But work, I think the work in which you're meaning to use it is not the classical mechanical sense of work, but rather economic work or economically productive work.
Of all type. Yeah.
Right. Which again, may not require any energy expenditures on margin at all.